Think like a psychologist. How to analyze emotions, read body language and behavior, understand motivations, and decipher intentions. Written by Patrick King, narrated by Russell Newton. And how does that make you feel? That's our typical conception of what a psychologist does. They'll ask questions, they'll make you talk about yourself, and then they'll sit back and reply with even more questions. Indeed, deeply understanding people's histories, experiences, and emotions will certainly let you analyze and read them. Suppose you ask someone about their parents, their upbringing, their past relationships, and how happy they are with their job. You interview them for 2 hours and ask probing questions ranging from interview to interrogation style. Armed with just a little bit of insight in psychology, you can now make a pretty reasonable hypothesis as to how they handle issues or how their worldview might be slanted to a certain view. In other words, it can get you to the goal of reading people. But none of this really gets us to our goal of analyzing and understanding people in a flash, from first glance, or purely from observation. Not to say that this is a goal that is truly achievable, but when we talk about analyzing people, we want to do it quickly for a variety of reasons. We want to understand them before they open their mouths. We want to be able to see their motivations. We want to be able to protect ourselves. We want to be able to connect and communicate better. We want to be more emotionally intelligent. We want to categorize people so we can treat them more appropriately. We want to know how to appeal to them, romantically or not. We want to be able to tell if they're lying or what their true emotions are, despite their words to the contrary. Everyone might have their own reason for wanting to analyze people at the speed of light. Yet, one of the bigger benefits is that through knowing what to look for in others, we can actually better understand ourselves. Lacking an understanding of yourself means that you won't know why you're behaving in certain ways. You may not understand how or why you got to where you currently are. More importantly, you won't be able to decipher your own needs and wants in situations. You're more or less winging it on a daily basis if you don't apply some of these same principles to yourself. Take a simple day-to-day activity of exercise to illustrate the importance of having greater self-awareness. If a man knows that he is more of an introvert, he may opt to take hikes on trails or utilize headphones at the gym to keep to himself. He'll spend a lot of time avoiding people, and he's well aware of that. He'll use his exercise sessions as an opportunity to recharge from the outside world and gather himself. If he was an extrovert, he might rather take a cycling class or work out with a few friends at the local park. He would seek to add a social element to most of his daily activities because that's what makes him feel good and energized. Both versions of this man know what he prefers as a result of understanding their own personalities. Thus, he places himself in situations he knows are best for him. Otherwise, he might engage in self-sabotage on a daily basis. Had the introvert not known what pushed him over the edge, he could have had an anxiety attack when walking into high-energy aerobics class. Or, had the extrovert embarked on a 5-hour solo hiking excursion to the woods, he could have been bored out of his mind. Knowing yourself and possessing self-awareness allows you to make more mindful decisions that are right for you. The more that you're well acquainted with yourself, the more you'll also see that your identity and purpose are wholly within your control. If that's a side benefit to understanding how to analyze people better, it's a pretty powerful one. It was the inimitable Albert Einstein that once said, "If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions." Just like the pithy example with the man and his choice of exercise, we can understand the parameters that we are working in and that other people are also working in, including but not limited to values, perspectives, self-identity, and overall personality. Everything else can flow more smoothly. Analyzing people is certainly a skill that has wide applicability, but it's not necessarily from asking probing questions like a psychologist or observing people's body language and cues like an FBI interrogator, even though we will go into depth about those kind of methods later on. There are multiple angles that contribute to a holistic view of a person, and it's only through taking them all together that we can be accurate. For this reason, it's helpful to start from the beginning in terms of how people thought about identity and personality. It will give you a general overview of how to think about people's behaviors and the motivations behind them. For instance, when you seek to read and analyze someone, should you be looking at their inherent temperament or rather to their environment? Are they learned or innately part of one's destiny? Are we slaves to our genetics and destined to be like our parents? Can we find an answer to what has been an ongoing debate and the subject of study by psychologists, scientists, and philosophers for decades? We'll get there. A brief history of analyzing. To understand how we arrived at the modern take on personality and identity that can inform our analyzing, it's helpful to start from a historical perspective. It comes as no surprise that one of the earliest theories stems from philosophers in the ancient Greek era. The Greeks first theorized that one could classify types of personalities and temperaments through humors. This was called humorism. It was Hippocrates, 460 to 370 BC, considered one of the founding fathers of Western medicine, who first developed and defined humorism as a medical theory. He believed that a person's mood and emotions came from an excess of 4 specific bodily fluids: yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. Thus, in varying amounts, these represented a person's personality traits and general temperaments. As a follow-up, in Galen's 129 to circa 200 AD dissertation De Temperamentis, he studied and developed the typology of these temperaments. He was determined to find the physiological reasons behind people's behaviors. Derived from the 4 elements of air, earth, wind, and fire, Galen classified these behaviors as being either hot or cold and dry or wet components. A balance between the qualities was also something that could be possible, and what Galen worked to prove as being the ideal personality. Galen theorized that an ideal personality comprised a complementary balance of hot or cold and dry or wet. However, eventually realizing that such balance was unlikely to characterize most people in society, he eventually codified 4 primary temperaments: choleric, melancholic, sanguine, and phlegmatic. These were respectively named after the bodily humors that Hippocrates noted. When humors would excessively produce, this would create an imbalance in paired qualities. Yellow bile, choleric temperament. This person is characterized as being confident, ambitious, overbearing, and passionate. This strong-willed personality tends to be more extroverted than introverted. Black bile, melancholic temperament. Melancholics tend to be reserved and thoughtful. They can be moody and expect a high level of perfectionism. They also value alone time and are mindful of making decisions. Blood, sanguine temperament. No social event can be without the social butterflies. Sanguine temperaments are people-oriented and are deemed to be the happy-go-lucky types, but they can also be a bit frazzled and disorganized. Phlegm, phlegmatic temperament. Loyalty and consistency are the best terms to describe phlegmatic types. They are quiet and stable, which are what other people appreciate to keep their relationships more balanced. They can also be seen as submissive due to their overly trustworthy behaviors. Many people will identify with some, if not all, of these humors. There may be particular days or situations that cause people to portray one or more of these temperaments at any given time, but generally speaking, one type of humor will be more dominant over the others on a consistent basis. Overall, humorism greatly centers around the individual possessing unique compositions, like a standard recipe with deviations here and there to add some personality and flavor. However, humorism never explained the reasons behind an individual's personality. Different humors must have aggregated in different amounts in people, but what caused it? Was it just a birthright or curse? Still, it works similarly to how we are trying to learn to do so with this book. With humorism, you would observe someone and then categorize their composition of humors. Similarly, we're trying to glean information about people through observations and then make conclusions about their character, tendencies, and traits. Humors may not be so helpful in the modern age, but the theory demonstrates a long interest in understanding self-identity and analyzing other people. Fast forward a few hundred years, and famous Austrian psychologist Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, came up with his own way of describing someone's personality and identity. Perhaps the best-known model of personality, though somewhat dubious in real-life effectiveness and application, is known as the structural model of personality. You know it as the three components of the id, ego, and superego. Freud believed that a person's psyche was centrally controlled by these three unconscious components, which were locked in eternal battle. He also believed that each component had a direct influence over the other, thus shaping someone's personality. Just like humorism, if there was any imbalance between the three components, it would give rise to certain types of personalities and identities, and related disorders. Id. Just give it to me. I want it now. The id follows the pleasure principle. Basically, a person will behave solely in a manner to collect a reward in the end. The id is the primitive and instinctive component of all three. As such, it functions solely on fulfilling those primal drives, such as hunger, sex, and all forms of pleasure. It is a single-minded drive. An infant is the perfect representation of the id because an infant only knows what it wants and cries when it is not received. Infants are impulsive and lack the ability to empathize or control themselves. It's only later that a newborn can actually develop an ego and superego through learned situations. The infant wanting dessert has no regard for reality. Instead, he is wishful in his thinking and wants that dessert if it's the last thing he'll ever get. This is where ego comes into play. Ego. I really want that, but how can I realistically get it? The id can't last forever in the real world in conjunction with other people and their own needs. The ego eventually takes over the id as the principle of reality. It helps a person acknowledge that there are limitations and external factors to someone's behavior. The same child will learn that he may not always get a dessert, especially if he acts up and throws his food around the kitchen. These were factors that weren't ever present before, and he's able to acknowledge now. Think of the ego as being the mediator between the struggles of unrealistic id and reality. Basically, this is where a child learns to make decisions while actually weighing consequences and things other than bare desire. Reasoning is one characteristic of the ego, as opposed to the more irrational id. The ego works by strategizing realistic ways to meet the demands of the id. This process usually means that there must be a compromise at some level. Sometimes it's necessary to postpone rewards so that one won't feel the negative consequences when reacting irrationally. The ego is more aware of social norms and decencies, thus teaching a person how to compose himself or herself in situations. There's no right or wrong. The goal of the ego is to attain reward without harm. In a power struggle, the ego will always fall to the id, but then there's the superego. Superego. I want that, but not if it makes me a terrible person. The superego helps the individual identify values and morals set by society and forces him or her to be more self-aware. Basically, the superego is the conscience sitting on your shoulder and asking whether you should do something or not. The superego can also be seen to suppress the primal urges of the id, but in a different way from the ego. Remember, the ego suppresses the id by reminding it of the practical realities of the world, while the superego suppresses the id by giving a test of values and morals before acting. And how do these three elements manifest? Suppose an infant initially believed that he could finish his meal and then a dessert would always come after, his id. However, he didn't account for other factors while he ate his dinner. If he threw his food around and made a mess, he learned that this was deemed as a negative behavior that could alter his happy ending, his ego. Finally, he felt shameful about disrespecting his parents and learned to correct his behavior in the future, his superego. Overall, Freud concluded that the three components of the psyche all had their own interests at play. This is what caused a person to think and act in a particular way. The child first acted out of selfishness and eventually learned to channel his emotions not only in favor of himself, but also to meet social norms. Many psychologists were greatly influenced by the works and studies of Freud, but the fact that his structural theory relies completely on unconscious drives makes it nearly impossible to prove and quantify. It becomes too inconsistent without data to study and confirm the id's or ego's existence and role. Thus, it can necessarily only remain a theory, which isn't so helpful for our goals of analyzing people from objective data points and psychological phenomena. Yet again, it is part of the puzzle of analyzing people because it shows the different forces that can drive people's behavior. If we're looking for more hard data and evidence on how to analyze others, we'll need to start looking at anthropology and biology. That's exactly what started to happen once the technology was sufficiently advanced. One biological perspective of identity is that the range of personalities and traits we display are a result of natural selection. In other words, the traits that people have now were more vital to their ancestors, and what remain are only the most useful of traits. The well-known principle of survival of the fittest is considered to have created at least the baseline for our modern personalities. Over time, survival of the fittest made people begin to develop characteristics that are split into two specific categories: intrasexual traits and intersexual traits. These are the two types of traits that assist in proliferating as a species. Intrasexual traits are what attract the opposite sex. They are mating displays, how we instinctually emphasize masculinity or femininity, charm and wit, and generally what feelings of love and affection are drawn from. When two people meet, they display particular traits that keep the other interested and engaged. The better they are at these traits, the more successful they are with mating and dating. Over time, these became instinctual behaviors that inform our personalities. Intersexual traits are what allow us to defeat rivals of the same sex for mating, dating, relationships, and all goals involving the opposite sex. In other words, how we compete and win. These traits ask the question, what makes us a more desirable mate than someone else? They make us more feminine or masculine, but this time in an attempt to stand out. Over time, these competitive drives also become instinctual parts of our identities, and of course, people possess them to various degrees. In terms of the direct physiological structure of our brains, contemporary scientists found that there is a direct correlation between the sizes of various brain structures and different personality traits. At the University of Minnesota, a study asked subjects to answer a series of questions pertaining to personality. Then the subjects were also given a brain imaging test where specific regions of their brains were photographed and studied. The dataset consisted of categorizing the study participants into 5 different factors for personality traits, the Big Five, which will be covered in greater detail shortly: conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, openness, neuroticism. The following conclusions were found. Researchers were able to discover that extroverted people tend to have a bigger medial orbitofrontal cortex. This is located right above and behind the eyes. People considered to be more conscientious had larger lateral prefrontal cortexes. Neurotically driven individuals had bigger brain regions such as the cortices, which meant this was responsible for their negative emotions. Agreeable people also had larger cortical regions. However, as opposed to neurotic people, these regions are a little more wrinkled and folded. This meant they are able to empathize with others and their thoughts. It is still unclear as to how brain regions correspond with openness and intellect. The results speak for themselves. They could now directly relate a person's brain graph to how this person behaves. This is a very real biological basis for differences in personality and identity. Nature versus nurture is always a compelling debate, and this demonstrates they will always be inseparable. While it's not quite practical to subject friends, new and old, to a brain imaging scan to understand their personality better, we're starting to get closer to the focus of this book, being able to read and analyze people through observations and objective data points. Takeaways. Seeking to analyze people and discover personality and identity has been a compelling issue for as long as we have been sentient beings. To understand ourselves is to make the best decisions, and to understand others provides the ability to make the most out of interactions, whatever your goal. Like many disciplines, study seems to have begun in ancient Greece with the theory of humorism, where 4 separate bodily fluids were present in the body in varying quantities that gave rise to different personalities and 4 temperaments in particular. One of the most seminal personality theories was put forth by Sigmund Freud hundreds of years later. This is known as the structural model, and you know it by its 3 components, the id, ego, and superego. Like the humors, they work together in varying amounts to form a unique personality. The id is a hedonist, the ego is the mediator, while the superego is the conscience. There's also a strong biological basis for differences in personality, identity, and the traits we might analyze in others. First, intrasexual and intersexual traits have formed the baseline for our modern personalities in many ways. Second, there are literal, biological, and physical differences between those who score differently on the Big 5 personality traits. Why does this all matter? Well, there are far too many reasons we might want to understand the people around us better and more quickly. And if you don't know where you yourself are coming from and where you are right now, how are you supposed to know where you should go next? This has been Learn to Think Using Thought Experiments, How to Expand Your Mental Horizons, Understand Metacognition, Improve Your Curiosity, and Think Like a Philosopher. Clear Thinking and Fast Action, Book 5. Written by Patrick King. Narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2020 by Peter Hollins. Production copyright by Peter Hollins.